Good day, everyone. My name is John McDermott, and I work for the Institute for Human Development in Flagstaff, Arizona. We are a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities located on Northern Arizona University's campus. Please take this opportunity to adjust your audio levels. This webinar is the first event in a sequence of 3 events. We would like to introduce the topic through this webinar, invite you to participate in an online community of practice, and then complete the sequence with a follow-up webinar that will serve as a final look at the topic. The URL to log in is the same for all 3 days. There are a few webinar ground rules that I'd like to discuss. This is a live listen-only webinar. Participants can utilize the chat pod to type questions or comments during the webinar. Feel free to write questions in the chat pod at any time, and we will address them in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. The webinar recording will be placed on the AIVRTAC website and then also viewable through the AIVRTAC YouTube channel. Towards the top of some of the pods, you'll see an icon with 4 arrows. This will allow for a full screen mode on your device or computer for that particular pod. Also, at the lower middle of your screen, you'll see a file share pod. These are files that you can download for reference. If you have any questions, please contact aivurtac@nau.edu. So please help me welcome today's presenter, Dr. Carol Bergquist, by placing a greeting in the chat pod, and I will hand it over to her. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, John. Well, welcome today to our webinar on promising practices for providing AIVRS services. And I'm very happy that you could all join us today. I look forward to our continued communication throughout this week. I'm here on campus at Northern Arizona University, and it's a rainy day in Arizona, which is a bit unusual, I think. I flew in on Sunday, and I've had a chance to spend some time with the team here, and it's really exciting. I think you all know Dr. Lee Gassioma and Suzanne Molson, who are taking the lead here, but their technical staff has been pretty amazing. So I've gotten to meet and work with some of the people who are behind the scenes. And I know how excited we were when this project got funded, because now we have our very own Native American Training and Technical Assistance Center. Yay! Whoops, I just blew the mic, John. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Carol Bergquist. I'm a project director at the Hannahville Indian Community for Project Visions, which is a tribal vocational rehabilitation program. We were first funded in 1995, and I've been the director at that time and ever since. So that's about 21 years of experience. I also worked for the Hannahville community since about 1989. I first came to help them prepare for writing a grant for a tribal vocational rehabilitation service. They had written one grant on a typewriter, remember those days, and it wasn't funded, so they had contacted me as a person that might be helpful to them to write the second grant. So way back then in 1988, I came for a week, and I've stayed 30 years. Before we begin the actual webinar for today, I want to review the purpose of all of our efforts, and I know that you're familiar with this because this is a part of every grant we have ever written. And our purpose is to serve tribal members with disabilities who reside on or near designated service areas, consistent with individual strengths, priorities, concerns, abilities, capabilities, and informed choice. To prepare for and engage in high-quality, competitive employment will increase opportunities for economic self-sufficiency, including telecommuting. When the opportunity came to participate in the training and technical assistance at Northern Arizona University, I was really excited about the opportunity this might provide to start telling the story of developing a tribal vocational rehabilitation program on various reservations and Native American and Alaskan Native communities throughout the United States. And I guess I'm at a point in my life where I start thinking about that many of us who are directors are been here a long time. We're thinking about retiring or moving on, maybe doing something else. And as people leave, it's just saddened me because there wasn't a way that we were capturing the information that they had to share. And when somebody left, that part of that story was gone with them. So I started thinking about it and talking to a few people, and everybody seemed to think it was a very good idea, but nobody really wanted to do it. So I finally said, well, if not now, when? And if not you, who? So here I am today. It's been a great journey, and it has been a personal stretch. The personal stretch wasn't talking to all of you and putting the report together. The personal stretch was sitting here in this high-tech setting of a webinar and doing all the talking, which is something unusual for me. So I want to start out by talking about preparing, I guess, to interview directors about what their story was in implementing their program. Because I started thinking about our journey, and I thought about it in two ways, that we have really transformed vocational rehabilitation at two levels to implement it in a tribal community. First, we had to take that huge state, federal, bureaucratic system that was the only model we had to follow. And we took that and tried to implement a very kind of similar program, similar in that we had to follow the same regulations in these small rural communities. And it was quite different from the setting that the state VR was implemented in. Once we did that, we then had to transform what we knew about the regulations, providing services, to make it friendly for Native people. And that might have been the biggest transformation of all. And again, this slide just reviews the transformation. So in thinking about how to do this, I'm borrowing a phrase from Lyle, but I'm a humble woman. So I knew that I had a lot to tell, but I didn't have the whole story. And the whole story could only be told by all of the people. And although it wasn't feasible to talk with all the people, I decided that the people that would be most experienced and most capable and able maybe of telling that story was people that had been with the programs a long time. So, and I also thought that a way to do it would be a personal interview with the directors. And this would be by telephone, since it was not feasible to fly around the country and interview everybody in person. Well, that would have been wonderful. So I want to talk a little bit about the method. And I have a few props here that I'm going to share with you, just so you know that my part of this is not high tech, and it's something that we can all do to tell our story. I started out with thinking about the process of doing this, as I mentioned. And so this is a draft version, but I had lots of draft versions. And this is the draft versions of what I saw as the premise and what the assumptions were and the purpose. And this was something that I had to submit to Northern Arizona University and have them look at it to see if this was okay to proceed. I then took our trusty list of all the programs that are funded by RSA, and this was earlier this summer. So these were all the programs funded, and I went through and I identified people on the list that I thought had been a director for at least 10 years. I came up with 29 people. And I thought that was pretty amazing, because just looking through that, I was amazed to see that over 1/3 of the directors had likely been with their program 10 or more years, and that shows a lot of longevity and commitment. And there may have been more than 29. These are just the ones that I thought about at first. So I took that list of directors and I sent an email. And on that email, I invited each of those directors to participate in a telephone interview to talk about the story of how they implemented tribal vocational rehabilitation in their community. I also attached the list of 29 and asked them to review the list and to identify anybody that I might have missed. So I sent that out, and then I got to work on the questions. And I developed several drafts of the questions and kind of tried them out, but I did create a survey instrument. And the final survey instrument, ironically, contained 29 items. It wasn't exactly high tech or some selection process that I did to select the directors to be interviewed, I simply interviewed the first 10 to respond. To do the interviews, I took the questions and made a form that allowed room to write in. The tools of my trade, cell phone and different colored markers and pens. This is an example of an interview. I'm not sure you can probably see this from what this is an interview with Tom Cyrus. And obviously you can see that my form was not big enough, that Tom had a lot to say, and I was busy writing it down. But for each of the 10 interviews, I followed the same process. Interviews took about an hour and a half a piece, depending upon how chatty we were, and sometimes we got kind of chatty. After the interviews were done, I conducted analysis and synthesis of the results. And this is as high-tech as my analysis is. This is a question about implementing the state program and what the changes people did, taken from all the interviews. And I just made a list by each person that I talked to of what they had identified. And somehow that turned into this list. This is the synthesis of all the items that people mentioned. And somehow with the magic and the talent of the AIVRS staff here, it finally came into a PowerPoint presentation that you're seeing today. And I'm showing you all of this simply because I want you to know that it's not something that is complicated. I've had people say, well, you can do it because you have a PhD. And it's not about a PhD. It's about having the interest and caring. Everyone that I talked with in the interview had much to share, and I had many more items than can be talked about today. But I was really excited about doing the interviews. I learned a lot, and the people that I interviewed seemed really happy to have the opportunity to share their story. They were also very interested in today's webinar because everybody wanted to know what the other people had to talk about. So let's begin. Starting with the list of the people that were interviewed. And as you can see from looking at the PowerPoint, there's a list of 5 names and then 5 on the next page. So we have Dallas from Alaska, Tom from Alaska, Rebecca from New Mexico, Sherry from Washington, Gloria from Minnesota, Mary from Mississippi, Amanda from Alaska, Christina, or we better know her as Peggy, from Georgia, Corky West from Wisconsin, and Michelle from Oklahoma. And of course, I contributed my part from Michigan. When I looked at the qualifications of people in terms of longevity, I was really surprised to find that among, well, the 11 of us, we had 157 total years of experience as directors in this program. And I thought that was really impressive. But the range was from 8.5 years to 23 years. And our average director position longevity was 14.3 years. So I think we show that we have very good. To prepare for the webinar, I was required to set up some learning objectives. So what you see on your screen now are the 6 learning objectives for today's webinar. The first one, that everybody that's participating will understand how AIVRS directors adapted the bureaucratic federal state VR model to work effectively in their rural and remote Native community. Learning objective 2, to understand ways that directors incorporated Native culture and practices, beliefs into their program. Number 3, to learn about promising practices that facilitate the VR process and enhance outcomes for Native people with disabilities across diverse communities. 4, to gain knowledge about lessons learned and accomplishments that directors are most proud about, and as directors reflected on the past, and to learn about the best advice that AIVRS directors received, advice they would give to a new director or a new Native community that was going to implement an AIVRS program. And the last learning objective is to gain knowledge about visions for the futures as directors looked ahead to the years ahead. What we're going to talk about today is really the first and the chapter, I think, in implementation. And this has to do with actually how, when the people that were funded at that time, they got the grant, how they took that model and really did that transformation into a vocational rehabilitation service delivery model that would work within their community. And so the questions that you will hear today are basically about the implementation process. The first slide has to do with how these directors really adapted that bureaucratic model to fit their communities. And all directors describe long-term and positive working relationship with their state VR agencies. You know, lots of times we're kind of negative about state VR and the tribal side, but they were very helpful and supportive to us implementing the program. Everybody also talked about how the strong support we received from RSA administrators. This was our funding source, and the project officers. They provided us with information, resources, and most of all, caring. Dr. Finch, Pamela, Zane, Sonia, Teresa, Mark, August, and others truly walked the AIVRS walk with us. We also identified our other project directors, and the friendship, the companionship, collegial relationships, and the actual we-can-do attitude that the directors had. And then the camaraderie of KNAR, our professional organization. In talking about the implementation, I took the information, probably put it into a table. So this table has to do with what we tried to develop on the tribal side compared to state or public VR. And we'll just go through the table. One of the first priorities was that people trusted their tribe, and they certainly didn't trust outside governments. They didn't necessarily trust the state government. They didn't necessarily trust the federal government. So we now had a program that could be implemented within our communities. The proximity to the community was also a very basic of our program. Prior to having our own program, people, if they wanted VR services, they were available from the state, but they often traveled many miles. For example, at Hannahville, our district office for Michigan Rehab Services was 80 miles away. We wanted programs that were definitely native friendly and not no-one friendly. We wanted services that were timely, that people could get almost immediately if they needed them. We wanted quick responses to their needs. We didn't want long waits for appointments and longer waits for services. We wanted all categories of disability to be open. And at some point, and especially today, many states are in order of selection. We wanted flexibility, not one size fits all or one size fits none. We wanted the opportunity to have multi-agency wraparound services. This was something that was very positive for the tribe because many of us are co-located with other services, and so that really provided easy access to, say, substance abuse or mental health services. Whereas on the state side, it's pretty much VR and a single-focused agency. Of course, small caseloads versus the large caseloads. We knew we had less dollars to work with because we just had our grant monies, and the state had much bigger coffers. We also had limited access to specialized staff, whereas the state had the availability and access to specialized staff. Like they might have one person that would be a specialist, say like in traumatic brain injury for the state, and they would be a resource to their counselors throughout the state. And we did not have that same similar access. Staffing was also an issue. We had few certified rehabilitation counselors on the tribal side, whereas many states had some type of certification required for their counselors, and so they definitely had more certified personnel. On the tribal side, we have less confidentiality and less anonymity. And for those of you that have implemented programs and you're in the tribal community, somehow people know everybody that walks through your door. And so there's a little confidentiality, although we maintain that as in our program operations for our program. On the state side, the offices were largely distant, and so nobody knew who was accessing services. Our programs were designed specifically to specialize in for services to Native American people, whereas on the state side, they served all people. We also wanted services that we knew would work if they were culturally Native sensitive, and including families, where on the state side, there's maybe inclusion of some Native culture, but it's very limited, and there's seldom family inclusion. I know several instances where whole families have come in, even an extended family to come in to help make their person in their family, help them make that career decision. We both followed federal regulations. Our VR counselors on the tribal side and directors traveled to remote areas. You can talk to the Alaskan people, particularly about their travel distances and services. Whereas on the state side, VR counselors seldom travel to remote areas. Even where they do travel, say in Alaska to very remote areas, it might be only once a year, and it might be only to some villages, not all villages. We wanted another program that was tribally friendly. If a person missed an appointment or couldn't come in, we wanted to be able to accommodate them. Where many of us knew stories of people that if they missed an appointment for the state, they soon were deemed non-compliant and often got a letter in the mail saying, come to this appointment or we're going to close your case. And we didn't want that kind of operation. On the tribal side, we were into the holistic model, the mind, body, spirit, treating the whole person, where the state side had really developed as the medical model. We had our 5-year discretionary grants. They were formula funded, which means as long they met their numbers and goals, they had continuation funding. They didn't have the threat of not continuation. We followed grant regulations, our grant application and federal regulations. They followed their state plan and federal regulations. And lastly, on the tribal side, we would often meet consumers in their home or a place of their choice in their community, whereas on the state side, people are often expected to go to the counselor's office or to a designated area where they might meet people in a different community. In terms of implementation, one of the things we first looked at is what was it about your tribal community in terms of structure and attitude that was really helpful when you implemented your program, and this is what the directors identified. Tribal communities are historically collaborative, and in fact, the whole kind of model and lifestyle of Native American people has evolved to be this interactive relationship where people are interactive with each other, they're interactive with the environment, they're interactive with the seasons, and that whole type of relationship was really important. We started doing the interactive model of service delivery. That same interactive relationship would often go to other programs, so it was easy to collaborate with service providers and work together. And the directors talked about efforts in, say, outreach, event planning, and collateral service provisions that were really helpful. Oftentimes, programs would do outreach for each other. Say, the VR program would outreach for mental health services, substance abuse services would outreach for VR, medical services would outreach for all of us, that type of interaction. Or maybe planning an event like a Disability Awareness Day or a mini powwow that could be done across programs. As cooperative relationships also allowed for wraparound services, so we could treat the whole person. We could provide services together, all of the programs, or some of the programs anyway. And that was good for cost sharing because it could cut the costs for each program involved. Directors also talked about top-down administrative support. I think we all can remember that excitement of when we first got funded with our grant and how happy everybody was because we had the opportunity to address this really important problem, which is the employment of tribal people with disabilities. And that top-down administrative support has usually lasted. And I know each time we've gotten refunded, it's still that same excitement, and everybody's so happy that we will be able to continue. The directors that serve multiple communities or multiple site locations, such as pueblos and villages, talked about having that similar type of administrative support there, because each of these entities would usually have an administrator that was served on their tribal council but they also provided a lot of support for the VR programs coming into their communities in terms of organizing activities and making sure there was a place to meet and that sort of support. And our VR programs located on tribal lands did provide for immediate program access at a nearby location. Additional things were nearby or co-located services, which also included hospitals and medical clinics, maybe the dental clinic, and as an educational service, as well as tribal employment. And during this time, tribal employment was in a big growth period. And most, or I shouldn't say most, but many tribes were in economic development. I know from our experience, gaming operations and all the related services that go along with that, it has been a huge increase to tribal employment in our area. And so this growth also offered people coming into our programs that had this economic development, the possibility of real and lasting jobs and career paths right with the tribe. We also learned that Native people with disabilities are strong and resilient and ready to create and actively participate in their own plan for employment once they got the opportunity to do so. There's also the other side of this, and this is the part of the tribal community that maybe was a barrier or an obstacle to implementing our programs. And one we all talked about was the logistics of available space. There were not many buildings, and they were often old. They were certainly not accessible to people with disabilities. We also had poor and non-existent roads and limited technology or telecommunication infrastructure. I remember some of those first conference calls when we were trying to communicate with people, or even having a fax machine was sometimes a challenge. Another obstacle has been, and we talk about this over time, is the kind of need to do a continual education for people. It doesn't seem to matter how long we've been in our community, that people don't seem to not understand what VR is. And this is true for our tribal leaders, like our tribal councils, other program directors, tribal elders, cultural leaders, and even potential consumers about exactly what we are is VR. And you know, people joke about, well, VR is not vehicle repair, and that we're not a make-a-wish operation either. Staffing was a big issue for us. It's hard to find staff in our local areas. There were few people that had any experience with vocational rehabilitation, and if they did, they were already probably employed. And it was also difficult to attract people from outside areas to move to our communities to become employed and be our project directors and counselors. So that was a challenge that we had to work through. There were also many transportation issues, including no public or tribal transit, few personal vehicles, and if there were a personal vehicle, it was seldom insured and in good working order. There's also a lack of people having driver's license, and poor roads, or the Alaska people will tell us, no roads, and the high cost for traveling to distances, which really impacted our budgets. Other barriers included that people came in, it wasn't just with one disability. Often they had multiple disabilities, and they also had a history of substance abuse disorders, often a criminal background, no driver's license, no vehicle, and a poor employment background. And tribal communities, as we all know, are membership communities. And working in a membership community, you have a card-carrying member, so there's no anonymity about who's involved. And everybody, it seems, no matter how large your tribe is, knows everybody else because you're all family. Everybody knows that person, they know their siblings, they know their parents, and they know everything they have done almost every day of their life. So there's no escaping or reshaping your personal history when it comes to applying for a job, because everybody knows your total background. There's also something that one director referred to as gossip in the village. And this is when our consumers, we tell everybody what we exactly did for them, a program, what we purchased or a service we might have provided, and they're proud about this, and they don't might want to share it with everybody else. And then we spend the next several weeks getting a lot of requests from people coming in and wanting the same thing. The second transformation was actually bringing Native culture into our programs, and directors had several ideas and several examples of things that they had done. One was employing staff who were Native, and if they weren't from that tribe, at least they knew the history and they knew some of the culture and maybe some of the language of that community. And if people were not from the tribe, people like myself who were from the outside and were not familiar with that tribe's history and culture, there were ways that we structured things so that we could learn about that tribal culture and history, at least to the point that we knew what we needed to know to implement our program. And it was an ongoing learning process. Also, locating the tribal offices for VR programs in a central location, maybe even the hub of the community, was also important. We wanted a place where tribal members at least felt comfortable going. You know, we were a new program, new services, sometimes strange people coming in. And at least if there was a comfort zone in coming to our offices, it was a big plus. We also tried to arrange and decorate our offices in Native-friendly ways, and also to provide services in that order. And I don't mean just our VR services. One example is having a public space and a coffee pot going that people would feel welcome to come in and have a cup of coffee and have some conversation. And they might not even be people who are interested or consumers of our programs. Also, we had the opportunity to offer culturally relevant services and resources. And this would be very different for different directors and in different locations. Many would identify the resources, and oftentimes people that came in for services were really wanting to reconnect with their culture. And so they wanted to maybe go to a ceremony or a sweat lodge. And so having this list of resources, if they weren't known to the person, we could help them connect with those. We also had the opportunity for someone who wanted to pursue that further to make that really a part of their IPE, so that there was a definite Native component of culture and spiritual teachings. And I know there were some directors that said almost every one of their consumers had that as an IPE goal, one of the goals. We could provide cultural activities, events, and classes, sometimes for outreach or for healing. People would do a class, say, in beading or regalia or wood carving or something that would be appropriate for their community. And they could invite people to come in, and it was just a way of teaching and learning. We could also do goals for employment that might support a cultural position, such as a firekeeper or somebody that wanted to be on the drum, or somebody that wanted to learn to be a spiritual person. You know, how could they do that? We also could support self-employment in cultural ways. So there were people that wanted to produce a product and sell it. Maybe it would be, say, beading or pottery or jewelry making. They could produce a product and sell that, and we could support that as a business. And then there's the whole story of subsistent lifestyles. And I really enjoyed talking with particularly our Alaskan directors about this. I'm hoping that this is something that we can continue in our community of practice, because I think we have a lot to learn about that. At least I did. We also learned that strong spiritual beliefs provide inner strength for people that are really on their journey, and that this would be true for individuals or groups. So having that ability to write that right into our program and provide those services was a huge benefit. We also had to deal with the different concepts of disability. And we'll talk about this a little more later, but disability can be viewed as either a gift or a stigma, depending on the location. There are also some, well, I think ways of interacting more than practices that people identified that we needed to consider for job seeking and employment. And one thing I know I've experienced with is, you know, teach job seeking skills. And one of the skills about interviewing is to be able to talk about your background and talk about your abilities and your education and present yourself in a very positive way. And many people I know and other directors concurred that really that was something that was not, they were taught not to brag about themselves, and that would be not culturally appropriate to put yourself forward in a very positive way. Another issue was speaking up for yourself, and especially like this occurs in some job situations where an employee might be confronted by the supervisor about something that happened on the job. And instead of maybe explaining their side of it, they would simply walk off the job or not return the next day or not return any day after that. There's also the real issue of tribal clan responsibilities. And these are really paramount to people. If their clan and their tribe and their family come first before a job. And so if they got the call to come to participate in a ceremony, they would go. And it wasn't such an issue for people that were employed with on-reservation or tribal employers, but for those off-reservation jobs that people got, it was really to be gone 3, 4, 5 or more days at a time for a ceremony. Oftentimes employers didn't understand that, and it would result in a job loss. Our next set of questions has to do with how Native culture beliefs and practices that really promoted the implementation of effective VR services. And in most Native languages, there's no word or concept for disability. Differences or varying abilities are viewed as gifts from the Creator. And it's up to that tribal community to assist that person in finding the ways for that member with disabilities to contribute to the whole. And this was the situation when I arrived at Hannahville. And I thought it was amazing because in my work in disability areas before I came to Hannahville, we were really working hard to get the dis out of disability and really put the person first and view people as equals, and everybody has differing abilities, that sort of a concept. And to provide services, the person really had to say they had a disability, sign a form that they had a disability as part of eligibility. So it was really a stretch for me to have to talk to people about what is a disability and what you are experiencing qualifies as a disability. And to provide our services, we have to acknowledge that you have a disability through medical records or mental health records or whatever. Now, there were a few tribes that reported during the interview that in their location, disability was not viewed as a gift, but more as a stigma. And that person often felt shame. And sometimes people were even hidden at home because it was a shame to the family to have a member with a disability. And in that instance, directors talked about ways that they worked to have people with disabilities included. They did maybe a disability awareness day, and they really, their strongest way of showing that was having successful consumers with disabilities that would progress into jobs and that people never expected them to do. And that was really a message to everyone. The holistic view of wellness, treating the whole person, body, mind, and spirit, healing from the inside out, fit well into our programs. As I mentioned before, the Alaskan directors I talked to talked about subsistent lifestyles and looking at those as real employment. And sometimes that was hard to do because of the definition of the federal competitive employment model. But subsistence is a well-respected, culturally integrated way of life. Other ceremonies like sweat lodges, longhouses, walking the circle, talking circles, ceremonial fires, seasonal ceremonies, all support holistic wellness. And we could incorporate all of those and more into our programs. There's also the role of humor. And the telling of a funny story or a good joke, especially a joke on someone else, seems to me a big part of what I see as the Native culture. I've never met people with such a great sense of humor. And of course, many times being a white woman from the outside, I was the brunt of the joke, and everybody had a good laugh, including me. And I could share some of those with you at KNR in person. We then talked about cultural beliefs and practices that might be more of a barrier to our implementation. And the first one that was identified almost right off the top by all the directors was trust and mistrust. And trust is critical in developing trust, is especially in a counseling relationship, is to have interaction over time, and the interaction needed to be meaningful. And there also was the issue of general mistrust for non-natives coming into the area, which we all understood, but had to work with that mistrust and help hopefully turn it into trust. In the counseling situation, people are really reluctant to share private personal information about a disability with a stranger or non-confident. And this was something we needed to work with. And oftentimes directors talked about how they would take that intake process and the eligibility process and break it up into smaller steps. So the person might have multiple appointments instead of one appointment to come in and meet with the person and be expected to do this disability self-disclosure on the spot without really knowing who they were talking to. Another issue for us is, particularly as directors tried to hire Native staff and promote from within and train tribal people into the jobs that we needed for our programs, was the conflict when a VR counselor and a consumer had a relationship outside of our program. For example, that consumer coming in may be a family member to that counselor, or it may be a friend, longtime friend, and that was always an issue. Directors talked about doing some things programmatically to, like if they had another counselor, maybe a non-native counselor, that counselor could work with that person that was a family member. Sometimes the director would take on the role of counselor because there wasn't anybody else that didn't have that type of conflict. But whatever, it was a huge issue to really do some education on ethics in terms of how do you proceed and operate your program when you run into this situation. And at some level, you know, all tribal members of a tribe are family, and even with other neighboring tribes. And then there was always that, I call it more an attitude, that believing that your family ties will get you the job, even if you don't have the skills and abilities, and that you really don't need to participate in the voc rehab process. When people first come to voc rehab, they come in because they wanted to change. And sometimes I wonder, I see somebody that I've known for a long time and know and maybe talk to them about our program. All of a sudden one day that person walks through the door. And you know, when they walk through the door, how did they get there? What was their reason? And so one of the questions for directors was, when people come to your program, what is the change that they're seeking in their life? And the directors talked about the fact that when many people come in, it's kind of like they've hit bottom, and that most people are really at economic survival and are requiring, you know, like food and shelter. And that they might have an immediate need for a job because they have an immediate need for a paycheck, and they can't address any higher order needs until those basic needs are taken care of. Another director described them as many are lost, disenfranchised, depressed, in a very low place. A significant necessity is to meet basic needs first before employment goals can be developed. People who feel a little value, no money, no job, no hope. There's also a different group that people talked about, and that was some of the young adults that are coming in today. And tribal life has changed a lot on many tribal reservations and in many communities. And I talked a little bit before about the economic development that has gone on. But the young people coming in have still come from this generational loss of culture, loss of language, kind of a disconnect, and also poverty, alcoholism, and more recently drug disorders. But they've also grown up in this kind of a new age of opportunity, where there are usually the possibilities of jobs on or near the reservation, and that person can really think about their education, their future, and think about having a career with your tribe. And of course, there are other people that come in that are very organized and know exactly what they want, if it's education or employment goals. Another director said it depended upon their disability. They may want to contribute to their families, or they may want to take their own personal steps towards success. Consumers want to be self-sufficient, not on welfare. Consumers want to learn how to be employable in a non-native world, particularly if there were not jobs in their tribal communities. And other people described few job opportunities since many local industries had moved into Mexico or other countries. So people came in wanting retraining, and others were hurt on a job and needed retraining. Powerful supports that the programs could provide to assist the consumers in making the change they wanted, including our mainstay, which is counseling and guidance, job placement, physical and mental restoration, training for lifelong economic change, assisting in getting the equipment to enhance their subsistent lifestyle. We also talked about the importance of collaborating with other tribal and state programs to meet needs and also maximize resources and empower people who want a hand up and not a handout. The AIVRS program becomes a powerful ally in life change. Consumers are often embarrassed because they're prideful people, and it's difficult for them to come and walk through our door. They want really more of a jump start. Directors talked about talking circles to discuss adjusting to a disability and found that those were often very effective, and teaching job-seeking skills almost always a must. The provision of cultural wellness activities along with encouragement and using tribal mentors to teach traditional skills was also valuable. And reconnecting with Native culture and spiritual teachings for many was a resource for all. In working toward the conclusion of our interview, I asked the directors about all the things that they had done. What were they the most proud? And here's what they told me. They were proud of their high-quality programs and their excellent services that promoted successful consumers' outcomes. They were proud to have many of their staff, now tribal members. They were proud about the increase in disability awareness and acceptance across tribal entities and communities. They talked about the great customer services we could provide. They talked about creating and implementing subsistence employment plans with consumers, and also cooperating and engaging and embracing change. And that would be change through the tribe and through state VR agencies or the local communities, and AIVRS having a very positive reputation. Success stories, empowerment stories, interaction with the healing systems, working with youth with disabilities and seeing success in jobs before they even left high school, breaking down disability stigma and stereotypes through successes, self-employment, business incubator models, which have had many successes, creating a training program in financial literacy and employability skills, as many people have never actually had a job, keeping students in school through graduation by providing advocacy and improving technology and computers and all that type of communication in the reservations and in the villages. Important lessons that directors have learned are never give up on a consumer. Someone may fail 2, 3, or more times, and then they will succeed. Employ qualified staff whose top priority is wanting consumers to succeed. Do whatever needs to be done for your program. Learn to listen, embrace the culture, listen to the tribal elders and follow their direction. Embrace Native traditional values and recognize the beauty of a subsistence lifestyle. Feel free to call other directors for suggestions and advice. Visit other programs if you can. Utilize all support. We have help provided to us through our RSA program officers, our monthly RSA calls, our 121 listserv, which we all communicate on, KNAR, Northern Illinois University AirTech, and Northwestern Indian College TVR Institute. Every Native community is different, but we need a good fit into each of our communities. Positive working relationships with tribal leaders and cultural leaders, and how to be culturally flexible, of course, while we follow the federal regulations, and appreciate the rhythm and the timing of the tribal cultures and traditions. Relax and be patient with the job search because it takes time. The quality of life for people is more important than a 26 closure, and adjust to changes in your local community and at all levels of government. What's the best advice that we've ever received? People had lots of suggestions for that. For the best solution, assess the situation, take time to think the situation over, then act. Do not take the stress of the job home with you. Your family needs you. Listen more, speak less, consult with your tribal elders, contact other directors and learn about their programs. Be your genuine self. Visualize the change you want to achieve. Be a good listener. Even the biggest problems will pass. Time is not replaceable, so take care and value how you use it. Work well with all partners, native and non-native. And ask RSA or other directors if you are unsure. And then what I would like to add is celebrate your successes. The next section has to deal with advice that would be given to a new director. So those new directors out there, listen up. Here's some advice for you. Learn your federal rules and regulations early and hire the very best staff. Be open to new perspectives, think outside the box. Job shadow with experienced directors and visit their programs. Make certain that IPE is a good fit for each consumer and practice informed choice. Discover your own community of directors and keep them close. Do not allow your tribal council or financial officer to dictate how you run your program. You are the expert. Don't be bullied. This can be a delicate situation, so if you have a problem here, you might want to consult with other directors or your RSA project officer. Know VR practices and learn the best way to facilitate those services in your community. Respect tribal elders, staff, consumers, and most of all yourself. Listen, observe, and then speak. Learn the regulations. Know your community, and then develop your program to fit your setting. Be aware of your staff's abilities. Look at their interests and how they want to grow, and how can they best contribute to the growth of your program. Treat staff and consumers like you want to be treated. RSA administrators and project officers are your friends. Access their knowledge and resources. They are invested in AIVRS success. And again, we have KNR, NAU, and Northwestern Indian College here for us. Advice that directors would give another community that was going to implement a program was learn and understand the federal VR model, the rules and regulations. We're big on knowing the rules and regulations, as you can see, which is very important. Acquire input from your tribal community, especially the elders. Be committed to your community. Establish working relationships with traditional teachers to incorporate traditional teachings and activities in order to help people with disabilities reconnect. Research, research, research. Talk with other directors, counselors, and staff. Although each tribal community is different, there are a lot of similarities. Make friends with your state VR to share resources, service provision, and consumers. Work together in open communication. State VR has 100 years of experience, and AIVRS can learn from them. We can achieve more together to meet mutual needs. Learn the regulations, stay neutral in politics, identify the barriers, know your culture. Take time to talk. Native people prefer oral and visual communication, not overwhelming, detailed paperwork. The end of the interview had directors kind of looking into the future about what they would like to see with their programs, and many talked about that they're hoping that their programs would continue, that they had worked very hard to develop a program, as had their staff, and they hoped that it would be maintained. It wasn't just about them as the director. One director wanted to see that everybody who wanted to work was working or had the opportunity to work, that the high quality of the programs would continue, that even more services would be provided to even more tribal people in their communities where they live, to keep doing what we're doing it, but do it on a larger scale, and to ensure that our programs continue to make a difference. A big thing we talked about that I know all of you believe in too is that we should all really work for non-competitive funding for our programs. It takes so much time and effort and stress that goes into our competitive grant applications, and we're uncertain about their continuation. And it puts us in a position where tribal programs compete against our brothers and sisters in our AIVRS family. This is the end of the webinar for today as far as the formal presentation occurs. I want you to know that I thoroughly enjoyed doing the interviews with the various directors. I learned a lot of valuable information myself. I formed lots of new ideas, and I realized how much we all had in common, and really how much of a very strong bond that we all share as we're all in this together. I hope these conversations continue. We have other activities planned for this week. The Community on Practice on Thursday at the same time, and then a follow-up on Friday at the same time. And I hope you can all join us for those discussions. And I hope that we can continue this conversation, and this conversation can continue with the help of AIVRTech here at NAU, but also through CANAR and also through our personal relationships. You know, in my 30 years in Indian country, I have really received more than I have given. I have learned much more than I have taught, and I have really been shown how to walk the walk. I'd like to thank you for your participation today, and never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead in Make-Witch.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome.
That concludes the presentation side of things. We will take some time here to answer questions that you place in the chat pod to the right of your screen. We also ask that if there's a group watching out there, could you please list the individuals in the chat pod as well, and we'll take note of that and add that to our results. Any questions that you have, please put it in the chat area. We'll just leave this sort of webinar running in the background for like 10 or 15 minutes, so if you needed to ask questions or come back and ask questions, we can find them inside there. So at this point, we'll just take pause and wait for some questions.
Okay, thank you.
You can place any comments in the chat pod as well. So anything towards AIVRTech or Dr. Carol Bergquist, you can add those to the chat pod. We have something from Mary Maruvia, and she states, this may be the first time that longtime AIVRS staff have been interviewed. I hope the results will be shared with other AIVRS staff not on the webinar today, and also with RSA.
Hi, Mary. I think you were the longest serving director that I interviewed of 23 years. That's pretty amazing. I guess we're seeing this as just the first of many conversations. And I think that the enthusiasm that people had to participate and share and wanting that information to be passed on. It's like every time a new program starts, people are kind of reinventing the wheel. And often I know new directors, even though they're encouraged, they're reluctant to reach out to others and that they know that we will help them. So we've already been talking this week with Lee and with Suzanne and the staff here about how we might at least start archiving the information. And I know that they have just completed 4 talking circles with directors in locations around the United States that many directors have participated in, and that's part of the conversation too. And that was something that came up, I know, in the group that I participated in last week in Albuquerque. So thank you for your participation, and thank you for your comments, and you can be part of that conversation. You could do a webinar, man. I will coach you.
Just want to remind everyone that in the Files pod, you can download the PDF version of this presentation. And also in the chat pod, we've placed a webinar satisfaction survey. You'll receive this in an email after the webinar as well, but if you want to go take it right after the webinar, feel free to click on that link.
And also our conversations will continue at 2 other times this week. You'll have an opportunity as well.
And a reminder on that part that it's the same URL. So the email that you received when you originally registered for the event will work for the community of practice and also the follow-up webinar. Thursday and Friday of this week. Same time, 11 a.m. Arizona. Well, we're 1 minute past the 12 o'clock hour here in Arizona, so we can kind of shut off the audio and the video, but we'll leave the webinar running. So if there are individuals that want to place questions into the chat area in the next 15 minutes or so, or any kind of comments, you can share there, and then we'll be able to address any questions or comments during the community of practice on Thursday.
Thank you for participating. See you at Keynote.
Thank you, everyone.